Hello friends, welcome to the series which we are doing on issues in world history, the 20th century, and today we'll talk about the Russian Revolution. In the earlier two lectures on the Russian Revolution, we talked about the various aspects of the Russian Revolution. We talked about the 1905 revolution which took place, and thereafter the kind of changes which happened in the Russian society. We also talk about the February Revolution of 1917 and thereafter the October Revolution of 1917, the failure of the provisional government which was formed, and how when the Russian Revolution took place, it talked about destroying the basis of capitalism and the economic and the social aspects with regard to the Russian Revolution, where they talked about the abolition of the private property that was also being discussed, and how the profit motive was not to be there in this kind of a development which was happening in the framework of the socialist changes which came about. And they all were talking about the centralized economy which was to be under the state, the introduction of the 5-year plans which was introduced, in which we also find that India also adopted the 5-year plans, and some kind of an impact on the Western democracies and the Western countries, where we find they also talk about the idea of welfare state. In the context of women, we also talked about that how some kind of inequality was being given to them, and various kind of measures in terms of maternity leave or crutches at work, public canteens, etc. They were also being created. And another important development during this time was in the framework of the separation of religion from the politics and the state was another important measure of revolution. And it was being talked about that religion was to be purely a private affair, and no religious education was to be given in the schools, no public utility to be made of religion, and religion itself was not abolished, and religious people were not persecuted as is generally believed. So we find that how the religion was to be seen in the framework of personal affair, and the state would not have any kind of a religion. This is what the Russian Revolution talked about. And in the framework of the political aspects, we find that the Russian Revolution resulted in the creation of a state of the working people embodied in the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And it was recognized that the enemies of the revolution could still sabotage the interests of the people. So the proletariat revolution talked about how the agriculturalists, the workers, and the soldiers, they will form the basis of the Russian Revolution. And we also find that it was immediately followed by the intervention of 10 other countries on the side of the Russian landed aristocracy and bourgeois against the revolution and the working people of Russia. So in this sense, it was also very important for some time to have a political system which was dominated by the working class. And we find that this state, the Russian socialist state, was much more democratic than the states of the bourgeois countries, because it ensured the rule of majority of people. Majority in any society consisted of the working people, who were a minority that had privileges in the pre-revolutionary Russia. So Russian Revolution was talking in this particular framework. So this idea of each according to his ability, to each according to his needs, and this idea where everyone was to be treated equally, this idea that how the working classes, they are going to dominate the society in that sense, or the industries for that matter. And there are critics of such kind of a system, those who are going to argue and those who have argued as well, that such kind of a system was inimical to the interests of the people, those who were far more meritorious, and because of their merit or because of their worth, they could not get what they deserved. So, and state was the ultimate arbiter in terms of taking the decisions of the individuals, which was again against the interests of the individuals, that in any kind of individualism was being rejected by the Russian socialist state. And we also find, when we find that this was also seen as a temporary phase to be done away with, once political power of the ruling classes was totally destroyed and they were rendered incapable of sabotaging the revolution. So we find that any kind of a sabotage of the revolution by the bourgeois section of the society was to be rejected, or was to be in a way fought by the people, those who were part of the Russian Revolution. And in that sense, we find that the critics, they have in a way argued that such kind of a revolution was not in the favor of the capitalist class, which wanted to bring about change in the society through their own ideas and means, and the people, those who were full of enterprise, those who were few, and these few enterprising people will not get that kind of an opportunity where they are going to in a way bring about the changes in the industrial sector. So the socialist revolution in a way was a critique of these people, those who were trying to exploit the other human beings. And we find that how the bourgeois democracy was to be transformed into some kind of a socialist democracy during this time. And the freedom which was being enjoyed by a Soviet citizen was not only political freedom, but also freedom from the hunger as well. So we find that not only legal and the social equality, but also the economic equality was being talked about, and the realm of freedom was enlarged in the new order created by the Russian Revolution. So we find that how not only economic, but also other kinds of equality, they were being talked about in the Russian Revolution, whether they were the legal or the social, all sorts of equality they were being talked about. And we find that when one was talking in the realm of freedom, it was also enlarged in the new order which we see, which was as a result of the Russian Revolution. Apart from the social aspects, apart from the political aspects, we also find that Russian Revolution also had such kind of a touch which could be seen in the international framework, and we find that it was an important landmark or a development from the international point of view. And we find that how the Bolsheviks, when they came to power, then they abolished all the old secret treaties entered into by the autocracy and the provisional government. So it was a new kind of a development from the international point of view, that any kind of treaties from which were being signed with the foreign countries, whether by the autocratic government or by the provisional government, they were being abolished by the Bolsheviks. And many of these treaties were the secret treaties as well. And how it was also realized that people have a right to know what their government are doing, and that people of any country should have right to influence the foreign policy of their country through the debate and intervention. So we find that how people they were giving this kind of a privilege, that what their governments were doing, it was made known to them, and how they are able to in a way influence the foreign policy through debate, intervention, or having public opinion in that sense. And we also find that when Russia withdrew from the war, then it was to be done in an immediate and peaceful manner, and no kind of annexation was to be made by Russia, and no indemnity was to be paid during this time. So we find that they were the only political group in the world to put into practice such a declaration during that time, and how they in a way withdrew their claims over many of the areas in the Near East and the Far East that previous Russian government had been fighting over, and they declared themselves against the imperialism and lent support to all the national liberation struggles against the foreign domination. So we find that any kind of imperialist measure which was being taken by the colonial countries during this time, and how they were also ready to support all the nations of the world, those who were waging or fighting a war against the foreign countries during this time. As we have seen that how Asia and Africa, both of them, they were being partitioned and divided among so many colonial powers, Britain, France, for that matter, or other countries like Portugal, Spain. All of them, they had their own colonies in that sense, and these colonies, they were being exploited by these mother countries. And Russian Revolution talked about the liberation movements which were taking place across the world, international movement being one of them, that how the national movement in India was in a way supported by the Russian Revolution. So we find that the areas which had constituted the Tsarist empire, so the Bolsheviks, they recognized the rights of all nationalities to self-determination, including the right of succession. And we find that in the areas, as you can see on the screen, in areas where the landed aristocracy and the bourgeois, they wanted to separate the workers and peasants, they wanted to be a part of Soviet Russia, and how the Bolsheviks, they recognized the will of the masses and fought with them to consolidate the October Revolution. And the workers and peasants of the most nationalities were with the Bolsheviks because they knew that the defeat of the Bolsheviks would mean the return of the landlordism and the capitalist exploitation. So in that sense also we realized that it was an important development. Bolsheviks, they were very well aware of what they were doing and how they wanted to in a way consolidate the revolution in which they were part of. And we also find that they also talk about that how the workers and the peasants across the world of different nationalities, they had to in a way unite with the Bolsheviks. And they also in a way realized that if Bolsheviks would not succeed, then the earlier era of landlordism and the capitalist exploitation is going to come back. So it was an important aspect of that time which was being realized. And as I told you earlier as well, that how this kind of a revolution also had some kind of an impact on the national movement in India. And we find that how such kind of conditions which were being created because of the colonial rule, because of the British imperial system, how Indians, they were being exploited by the colonial rulers. So in such a kind of a situation, we find during this time that how the national movement, it evolved, and the various phases of the national movement, whether the moderates or the extremists, the phase of the revolutionaries, and also we find the arrival of Gandhi in the Gandhian phase, and the role of the INA and the Royal Indian Navy during this time. All of them, they in a way contributed to this particular time, where we find that how Russian Revolution also supported after that how the liberation movements across the world, they were being supported by the Russian Revolution. And we find that in India, especially, as I communicated, whether it was the Swadeshi movement which started in Bengal, or for that matter the political strike, the first political strike by the working class, which took place in 1912 in Bombay. So we find that how Indian leaders, they were also taking some sort of inspiration from the 1905 revolution, and how many parties which were consisting of the workers and the peasants, they were also being established in the later part. And so when you talk about that how the national movement had this kind of an impact from the point of view of the Russian Revolution, but we also realized that many of the revolutionaries in those who participants in the Indian national movement, they also realized that they also have to bring about changes in the Indian society through the revolutionary means, and how these revolutionaries, they were all influenced by the cult of bomb or the politics of bomb. And they realized that unless they are going to inflict some kind of serious casualties on the British rulers, then they will not be able to succeed, because how British, they were able to control them through their might. So their might had to be challenged through the might of the revolutionaries. And we also find that how masses, they also became part of the national movement in the different times of the national movement. And as I told you, when you talk about the various peasants parties or the workers parties, we find that workers and peasants, they were also contributing to the national movement. And when you talk about the various phases during the Gandhian times, whether the non-cooperation movement, and so non-cooperation movement was also a result of this understanding and organization, where we find that the peasants and the workers, all of them, they came together. And we also find the establishment of the All India Trade Union Congress during this time, and we realize such kind of participation by different sections of the society was also in the interest of the national movement, so that the base of the national movement has the diverse sections of the society, those who are part of the national movement. And we also find that in India also the Communist Party of India was in a way established in India, and various Indian communists, they were being trained in Russia, and they were borrowing a number of tactics or ideas from the Russian leaders, and later they were also being accused in that sense that how the communists and the socialists in India, they were too much dependent on these kinds of ideals, and wherever, especially during the 1940s, we find that during the Quit India movement, how the communists, they did not support the movement. So these were the kind of things which were very important from the point of view of the communists, that how they were towing the line of Russia. They were not, they have been criticized that they were not putting the nation first, rather their concern was with Russia. And we also find that during this particular period, apart from the Communist Party of India, we also see that how Congress also had a Congress Socialist Party, and some of the members of the Congress, they were also in a way part of the Socialist Party, because at that time there was no single party system. So a person could be a member of both the parties, and there were other leaders during this time, whether Namboodzri Pad or A.K. Gopalan during this time. And we also see that how the arrival of the communist movement, it also provided some kind of a dimension to the national movement, and how the class struggle which was being talked about in the socialist ideals was also being seen in the particular framework of India, and how the workers, they tried to struggle against the Indian capitalist class. And we find that such a kind of movement could also be seen in the framework of the workers, those who were now leading some kind of a protest against the capitalist section. And in this sense, we find that in a way the movement was radicalized in that sense, and we find that Nehru was particularly influenced by the Soviet Russia and the anti-imperialist thrust, and socialism became a pervasive term in the political vocabulary of the Indian leaders during this time. And we find that how 1930s was also a period where the Indian national movement reached a level where the bourgeois hegemony of the national movement was seriously challenged by the left, as has been argued by the left ideologues. And one has to also see that Indian national movement represented different sections of the society, and Gandhi also in a way talks about that how the various sections of the society, they have to come together to fight in the movement, because India being a multi-religious, multilingual, multi-regional country, and where we find that diverse sections of the people of society, they are living. So in that sense, you find some kind of a unified approach, and the approach of the Marxist in that sense, where they are only talking about the peasants and the workers and leaving other groups, was not a worthy kind of or a positive kind of a development from the point of view of the national movement. And that is why we find that Marxists, they have also been accused in the framework that they were not well versed with the Indian reality, and they were borrowing much from the other countries, and they were not concerned in the way that how they have to in a way connect with the Indian reality, even in the context of the national movement as well. And we find that a number of organizations which were left oriented, they were also formed, and how the national movement within this context, where we find that the worldwide struggle against the imperialism, which was led by Soviet Union, and it was recognized by the Indian leaders as well. But we also find some kind of critique of the leaders of the people, those who were proclaiming the socialist ideals, that how people, how the leaders, those who were talking in the framework of socialism and communism, and how they themselves were living luxurious lives, visiting foreign countries, and many of the leaders of the national movement, they could also be seen in this particular framework. So we find that in a way, talking about only the socialist ideals and not practicing them in their own life was one of the contradictions of many of the leaders of the socialist movement or the communist movement. And we find that when the Russian Revolution succeeded, that during this time we find that how the Indian national movement, or the people, those who were there in the national movement, they were able to bring about some kind of a challenge to the British imperialism. And we find that how when defeat of fascism and the capitalist crisis which happened after the Second World War, that was also there. And after that we talk about some kind of a process of decolonization, and decolonization got a thrust after this, where we find that many countries of the world, in Europe, in Asia and Africa, we find that they got decolonized, and the European countries which had a grip over these countries, they had to loosen their grip over them because of a lot of pressure after the Second World War, where a new order came, where the two superpowers, Russia as well as America, both in favor of the independence of these nations. And we also find that in China we also see a revolution, and how people's democracies in Europe were also formed. And this maybe could be one of the results of the Soviet Union fight against imperialism. And we also later see that in the context of India, we find the various movements with the Thibaga, Telangana, or the Royal Indian Navy mutiny kind of revolts, they were also there. And we find that Indian communists, they were taking a lot of signals from the communist internationals, and it was a very serious drawback in that sense, that many a times they supported the colonial government, especially during the Quit India movement, as I told you. And we find that when one is talking about the Indian Communist Party, that how it outlined its strategy and tactics on the basis of analysis of Indian situation and correlation of the class forces in India. But if in this it was guided by the experience of the successful revolutionary movement against Russian autocracy. So there were a lot of contradictions within their approach as well. And we find that how Indian society was also a poor society because of the 200 years of the colonial rule. And we see that how the Indian communists, they were also seeking inspiration from the Russian leaders, how they can bring about change in the Indian society. And we see that how when the Russian Revolution took place, and some kind of correlations, they were also being established within the Indian framework when the Montague Declaration was made in 1918, where gradual development of institutions of self-government was being made. But I think these kinds of correlations can be far-fetched, because in that sense that Russian Revolution itself was not able to establish during this time. And we in a way realize that such kind of ideas which have been talked about during this time, that they are being connected, can also be questioned during this time. So when we see that in India a number of Kisan Sabhas, they were being established, and how we find that Times correspondent in a way communicated that Kisan Soviet has been established in India. And we also see that we also find that because of the influence of the Soviet communists, they were also working underground as well, and Meerut conspiracy case trial was one of those examples. So such kind of correlations, they have also been seen in that particular framework, that how the Indian Revolution, Indian national movement and the Russian Revolution, they were also in a way linked in that sense. and we also see that how Indian communists, for that matter, they have also been that how they were seeking orders, or they were following the communist line from Russia, and many times they isolated themselves from the mainstream of the nationalist struggle because they were more concerned with the Communist International which was there in Russia. But we also see that the Russian Revolution itself was talking about the anti-imperialist perspective, and it was also on the democratic side in that sense. And in that sense, we find India and the other countries, for that matter, they were influenced by them, and the national movement of these regions, they were also influenced by them, and the aspirations of the people, they could be in a way answered because of such kind of a movement which was led in India. And they were talking about some kind of a change to bring a new kind of a social order. So in that sense, we realize that Russian Revolution was an important development in the world. But we also find that there are critics of the kind of social order it brought about, and the downfall of Russia in 1991, and thereafter the coming of the capitalist order in that sense in many countries of the world is also a development which one has to ponder over. Thank you very much.